next book, after the fiat standard, I'm writing also an economics textbook, Principles of Economics, is that energy itself is not something that's valuable. What's really valuable is power at a certain place at a certain time. So energy is infinite. There's wind blowing all over the earth at all times, and there's sunlight falling on the earth. The amount of sunlight that hits the earth in an hour, I think, is larger than the amount of energy that all humans consume in a year or something like that, or maybe it's in a day, something in that regard. So energy itself is massively, massively abundant. What matters is having the energy in the form that you want at the intensity that you want. This amount of energy in this amount of time directed toward meeting your particular need. And so when they calculate, that we have this much wind, they're measuring the total capacity of these wind plants if the wind is blowing, and they're measuring the total capacity of the solar plants if the if the sun is shining and the solar panels are not dusty, and all of these, all the stars are aligning, then yeah, you have all of this output coming out. But that's not really very useful as a metric, because people need a particular amount of energy at a particular point in time, and for that you need the fossil fuels as a backup. And if you don't have the fossil fuels as a backup, then you can have catastrophic and lethal failure. People die. I mean, children and children in hospitals on premature babies die if they don't get electricity to their incubators. It's as simple as that. So if the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, then your alternative energy plan means we just need to sacrifice all of our premature babies, which is what humanity did for the vast majority of human life. For the vast majority of humanity, premature babies weren't able to survive. But now with electricity, we can build those incubators where they can survive. And a lot of the people walking amongst us today, a lot of the people who are inventing amazing things, who are producing amazing things, some of your friends were premature babies, and they're only alive thanks to the fact that they had regular 24-hour electricity. So adding the kind of adding on all of these unreliable and unstable energy sources, which are produced only through fossil fuels, and considering it, saying, oh, well, they're responsible for 5%, and they've gone from 1% to 5% over the last 10 or 20 years or so. And so obviously continue to extrapolate, because, everything is exponential in today's world. So obviously this is, if it goes from 1 to 5, it's going to go to 5,000% in a few years. That's obviously nonsense. It's kind of like the participation trophy of energy, where these are just, we have the fossil fuels actually what's doing all the work, and these kind of children, they're like the children dragged along to just make them feel better about the fact that they're contributing. It's like it's like you have a plastic steering wheel that you give to your child in the back seat so that they think that they're driving the car while you're driving the car. This is kind of what these things are. We wouldn't have them if we didn't have the actual steering wheel steering the car, and without the car going around and the father being able to make money and earn money, he wouldn't be able to afford this little plastic wheel that he gives to his child at the back seat to keep the child quiet while dad is driving. But it's really, it's not fair to say that, the dad did 95% of the driving and the kid did 5% of the driving because he was holding that wheel.
Yeah, I mean, it is important that they are like everything is dependent on fossil fuels today. It's part of the lie of net zero. I mean, one thing that's important about what they call net zero is there's not one prosperous person, let alone area of the world, that is net zero in a way that can be scaled. So you can think about something like, oh, can Jeff Bezos be net zero? I mean, obviously he consumes a lot, but yeah, you could imagine he could plant a bunch of mangroves somewhere, right? And different trees somewhere, and it's like theoretically absorb the CO2, but that doesn't scale at all. In fact, all these tree planting things have massive scalability problems because you're creating more uneconomic forests than already exist. And that creates all these even more forest fire dangers. But if you just look at the numbers, there's no way to plant trees and absorb all the CO2 that we're emitting. And there's no way to do anything right now that in a way that's remotely cost effective at scale. So net zero, again, it's something that, the reason I call it genocidal is it's something that nobody actually does today in a scalable way. And they're saying it should absolutely be mandatory to do it in less than 30 years. Again, in a world that's deprived of, that's very short of energy from a human perspective. The other thing with the plastic steering wheels, it's notable that these uncontrollable sources of energy, they're almost exclusively used on the grid. And the grid is this amazing invention. I mean, the grid allows, you think about what it does. It allows us to take unpredictable demand and meet it instantaneously. I mean, it's really a remarkable achievement. Like all of us at any given time, you can use a lot more electricity and the grid totally handles it. So it's like, it takes uncontrollable demand and it meets it. And the way that it does that is through highly, highly controllable supply. That's the only way to meet uncontrollable demand. And what they're doing is they're adding uncontrollable supply. So it's really a vicious thing, but you can only get away with it because the rest of the supply is so controllable. And so there's this parasitism. And one of the dangers of this is that there's huge accounting fraud that can take place because it ultimately all exists as one machine. So you can do, for example, what Apple does, and you can say, oh, well, we're 100% renewable because we paid somebody to give us the credit for the solar and wind that other people used. And we paid for them to get the blame for the coal and nuclear and natural gas. That's literally what happens. That's these renewable electricity credits. That's what it does. You're paying for the credit for somebody else. But in practice, what's happening is it's a relatively small percentage of the solar and wind. And then they are parasites on the controllable sources of power. And then there's all of this dishonesty. But notice, nobody's building a factory with just solar and wind, right? There's no whereas you could build a factory with just coal or just gas. I mean, there are reasons the grid is better, but there are no real, besides people living off the grid at a very low level, there are no self-sufficient solar and wind solutions. So it's another piece of evidence that these are not all they're cracked up to be. Because if they were so cost effective, if storage was so cheap, solar panels were so cheap, you would just have all these independent plants that use them, and there are zero of those.